But I mean, it's, you know, when you think about it, they're trying to feel alive, and they're in a situation where they can't feel alive. You know, they can't feel the normal play of their instincts. And I'm gonna say, for me as a human being, when I was a child, I felt that way too. I often did feel literally caged. You know, I think a lot of us do. Maybe some of us, your memory doesn't go back far enough. But when you're a small child, we also grow up in very unnatural settings, even if they're comfortable. Zoos.
No, but basically, like, the whole reflection is like, and we've talked about Blackfish before.
Yeah.
Do you remember?
I never saw the film, but I do remember we discussed it, right?
There's this one. If I were to go back and do a Jae Costly video again, there's one guy who I would make a response to, and I so got sicker of the response videos. Like, it was just, in a big way, like the zoo stuff. It's such a part of my life. It's not a positive part of my life for so many reasons. It just got to the point where I was like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Like, for so many reasons, other than made so many videos on it. Like, I just don't want to talk about it. But if I was to make another one, there's this one guy. He's a former SeaWorld trainer. His name is Kyle Kittleson, and he has a YouTube. And his like big video is that he talked about like basically everything that was wrong with Blackfish. But he approaches the subject like from this perspective that an animal rights activist has no idea what they're talking about, specifically because they don't work with animals on an everyday basis. Now, like, from my perspective, I actually think he's deluding himself in his own way.
Yeah.
Because, you know, working with zookeepers, there are so many things that you convince yourself to believe about your relationship with the animals and what you know about the animals that no one can know because they've never worked with them. And I mean, which is interesting because the first thing...
It's the same with traditional farmers and traditional hunters. They always think they understand the mind of the animal. They've made up stories to explain their behavior, and I mean, it's in a sense, it's psychological projection, although not the way we normally talk about psychological projection. Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, go on.
But I was gonna say, the first video I remember they showed me, like, orientation day for zookeepers. They show you this video, and it's basically this guy. He talks about this horrible experience where he witnessed his friend and fellow zookeeper get attacked by a zebra. Zebras are one of those animals that I think a lot of people think are harmless. They're actually super dangerous. Horses and like, I don't know how much you know about horses and stuff like that, but zebras are notorious for, like, you have to have multiple water containers in their exhibit because they're particularly, like, protective of water. And, like, you know, you have to do all this stuff with the females around the males and stuff like that because they do, like, a whole harem thing and stuff like that. And they get in fights and it can be bad. And, like, he had this experience where his keeper was attacked by a zookeeper, and he talks about what he did and what the repercussions were, what he didn't do and what he wishes he had done. And one of the reflections he has is that, you know, you might think you know an animal, but all you can really say is, like, that animal has never done X and Y before. So it's basically, like, complete reflection that you start out with that completely flies in the face of basically your assumptions that you build up for the years going on from there, like what this animal is capable of and what they're not. But I remember, like, there were some surreal beliefs that zookeepers had. People who had been there in the field for a really long time. Like, I remember sitting at the lunchroom table and these two keepers talking about how stereotypical, you know, stress behavior, pacing back and forth, was exercise. You know, it's exercise. Yeah. That's how they get exercise. Yeah. And, you know, the only animals and I remember, like, there was a porcupine that lived at the zoo too, and I remember she would do this thing where she would go to the back corner and she would do, like, this, like, dancing movement, this swing side to side, looking at the back exhibit, not facing anything. Total neurotic behavior. Yeah. But I remember we would call it, her happy dance. She's doing the happy dance. Yeah. And it was just no one acknowledged that we were completely taking the edge off something serious. No one really wanted to acknowledge it.
That actually this animal is being deprived of the habitat it needs to have normal behaviors and normal, even mental health. Yeah.
But and I remember, like...
Can I mention one example of that I saw in the zoo in Kunming? Because it was interesting. I was there with my teacher as a translator, basically. And me and my teacher both picked up on how sad it was. We saw a red panda. So the red panda is much smaller than the black and white panda. It's a very different species, but that's what we call them, red panda and black panda. And there's a red panda in a tiny enclosure that was basically like a fence circling a tree. So it was just a tree, less than 1 meter on every side of the tree, like maybe half a meter of space on each side of the tree, the big tree, and then a little ladder could go up to like a little tree house in the tree that looked cute. It looked like a human kid's treehouse. And, we could actually see this red panda running in circles in its tiny habitat. And I think it's not too much to say that it was trying to cheer itself up before going...
Did it do the head roll?
It would be very hard for me to describe the behaviors, but also it was avoiding looking at the humans, which was very telling. I mean, I've seen that with animals sometimes, with chickens, when you kill one chicken and then none of the other chickens are looking at you when you slaughter the chicken, or they're looking away from the humans. They're avoiding making eye contact, or avoiding making eye contact with the chicken that's going to be killed or is screaming and dying. You can see chickens looking away. But the nature of this enclosure was so exposed. But yeah, it was really sad. It was always just interesting that me and her both picked up on it, because in a sense, like you were saying, it's like a seemingly cheerful movement, but you could see this animal was so used to living in this tiny enclosure and being on display all the time that it had developed these repetitive behaviors. I guess you could call them obsessive or neurotic behaviors of trying to make the best of its cage. Yeah, and and the other tragedy is there, right? It's like you never know, because intelligence varies a lot within one species of animal. People know that with dogs. One dog can be much more intelligent than another. Our family dog I had as a kid actually could understand quite a few words of the English language. Not that uncommon, but anyway, I would just say it was an unusually intelligent dog in some ways. Was miserable for that reason. It was much more unhappy because it was more intelligent. But you look at that, and it's like, to what extent does this red panda understand, what it's doing? Or, yeah.
No, the reason why I asked about the head roll specifically is the worst case of neuroticism that I ever saw was exactly the kind of cage that you described. Basically, like a little ladder up to a branch, and it was a Cody, which is like kind of like a large rodent that lives in There's probably another scientific classification that belongs to, but it's like a small it's like a South American raccoon basically, and it would literally do the same motion over and over again. And the head roll is the worst. When they'll climb a little bit on the cage, they'll do like this twist of the body to get back in the position to go to the other side of the cage. Like, it's just, there's no purpose for that movement at all, unless you're like struggling as like a captured, like injured, about to die animal.
But I mean, it's, when you think about it, they're trying to feel alive, and they're in a situation where they can't feel alive. They can't feel the normal play of their instincts. And I'm gonna say, for me as a human being, when I was a child, I felt that way too. I often did feel literally caged. I think a lot of us do. Maybe some of us, your memory doesn't go back far enough. But when you're a small child, we also grow up in very unnatural settings, even if they're comfortable. And I think that part of us also is rebelling against that, or is looking for a kind of stimulus or free play of the instincts, which would include the experience of fear, unpleasant experiences and, fear of predators and what have you. But we're growing up without that. Did I ever tell you, I knew one woman in Cambodia who told me, she described what it was like growing up with tigers, wild tigers, in the jungle of Cambodia. She was the last generation to have that experience, where literally, she had to guard herself against tigers when she walked to school every day. Tigers still ate people in her village when she was growing up as a child. I'm laughing about it, but that doesn't exist in Cambodia anymore, and in the whole world, there are a couple of places in India where humans and wild tigers live together. But in terms of evolutionary time, that's what a lot of us grew up with, right? Like, that's what we're evolved to grow up with, is looking over your shoulder, and not for the schoolyard bully, right?
That's because the animal. That's so sad, because the animal that I was talking about, that the keeper was talking about exercise. Oh, this is exercise. When it was a mountain lion,
right.
Literally walking back and forth the side of the cage, looking. Right. I think at the time I justified. Oh, maybe he's looking at the coyotes, because they're like a predator as well. They would live in the same range, but I think in reality, these are animals. All the worst cases were always animals who had really extreme levels of interaction with something. like the Cody that I was talking about, they live in giant groups with like hundreds of individuals, and this is a small like cage of this animal.
Right.
And a mountain lion, they'll range. Some of those big cats will have, bears too. They'll have really large ranges. Yeah. And these were relatively small cages, like
yep.
1 out of 100,000, like that, some tiny fraction of like what their actual range was.
Yeah.
But
to some extent, I just want to say, a mind with a human mind or an animal mind, a mind in a vacuum tends to resemble that vacuum. A large part of what our mind does is like a mirror. And, you know the myth. It's a total lie. There's a total lie that's commonly believed that, the goldfish has such a short memory that it's never bored inside a goldfish bowl. Because, every few seconds, it's, you know what I mean? It doesn't know where it is. Have you heard that lie? That's a commonly told lie to children. That, don't worry. Don't worry. The goldfish are happy just swimming back and forth in their same bowl. Not only is it untrue, but, when scientists researched it, they have a photographic memory and can map out huge areas of the ocean floor. And that's what they're evolved to do, is range over this big area with complex three-dimensional habitat, and also be watching for predators all the time. That actually, the wild form of the goldfish has quite impressive mental faculties. And then you take them and you deprive them of that, even when we're not talking about castration and declawing and these other elements. Yeah, I think that's the tragedy of it. And I say, look, I mean, I don't know if I'm flattering myself or insulting myself, but I am in some ways burdened with very accurate memory of childhood. And I can relate to some of that in terms of my own experience as a mammal.
But back to the Kyle Kittleson guy.
Sure.
One of the things that he explicitly says in his video that I find particularly ridiculous is he literally says, he talks about this story about how the killer whales, because that's what he did. He literally worked with these killer whales at SeaWorld from the Blackfish movie, and he talks about how we would open up the bigger tanks for them to go in, and they would stay in the small ones. So that means to me that they wouldn't want to go to an open water pen. That would be, he literally says, that would be the worst possible scenario for them.
Yeah. And
it boggles my mind. Yeah. On one level, I give him a little bit of a pass. That I've met people who, they're zookeepers have biology degrees. They've studied the sciences. Kyle Kittleson is someone who, his background is in theater, which is not actually that uncommon. It's in some ways, it's such a low-paying job that, you get people who, who are art students who love animals, who are, they get it. They understand animals. They grew up with animals that, they get in that career path. Kyle Kittleson's really good at what he do. I'm sure he's an amazing trainer. I'm sure the dog that he trained to get the beer from the fridge for his master, a function that, of the things you could teach an animal to do, to get them something that actually destroys the brain of the person that's performing the task. Is there anything more demeaning?
It's poetic in a way. Yeah.
But he's sitting there and he's like, I have 8 years experience, and this is my conclusion, that the worst possible thing from a biological and ethical standpoint would be to allow these animals in an open water tank. Yeah. It's the things that professional people convince themselves of, that have all this experience around these animals. It's just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And
look, I agree with you, but I think that's part of the myth-making, self-justification side of the human mind. And I can really remember, in terms of my own maturation, for me it was really a conscious decision not to live that way, where it's I'm not going to make up excuses. I'm not going to make up justifications. But for a lot of people, that's what their whole ethical system hangs on, whether it has to do with, keeping a whale in a bathtub or here in China, justifications for mass murder, for millions of people dying, and the role they may feel they played in it, or that their parents played in it, or what have you, or that they're playing a part in right now, just being part of the society. Don't worry, we can stick with zoos. We don't have to talk about mass murder. Don't worry, stick with zoos. It's cool.
I think just to wrap the whole thing up, the manager, I remember I talked to you about the manager who would storm out of the meeting room about the cage in a cage. He actually had this one really awesome lucid moment that I remember vividly. It literally the most common thing zookeepers talk about around the lunch table is a negative a negative turned positive interaction with a guest who comes to you and they're like, the animals are living in such horrible conditions here.
Right.
I can't believe that this is happening, and it always has the same path. It seems it goes. You talk about conservation. Because all the animals here are part of some conservation program, and I mean, I've worked with animals that were part of conservation programs that were literally sick on a daily basis, and it's like, are these animals ever going to go back to wild? Yeah. And I remember, one day he was just like, he was listening to this conversation about about conservation, like this interaction. He was like, kind of like, stop. I think on some level his whole point was, I think on some level, the most thing that we can say to these people is we're doing the best we can. Yeah. And I've had arguments with people on Facebook, because especially on Facebook there's this clear divide that people have in their minds. Sanctuaries are good, zoos are bad. Mm-hmm. And I'll say to people, 90% of the people who work in zoos have biology degrees. They have years of training in this. SeaWorld especially, all those whales, Kyle Kittleson is right. They have 10 vet staff to take care of each of those whales. Like, from a pure health standpoint, probably the best care in the world. And, these are people on a daily basis. I remember a vet told me once, the best vet I ever worked with, he said, from my standpoint, the best vets have to realize on some level that the people who work with these animals on a daily basis, they really view them as their pets. I just think they're so similar, in a lot of ways that vegans are not willing to recognize. And I think zoos have some things going for them, and sanctuaries have some things going for them, and I don't think they're that different. But
I think I was definitely the first vegan on YouTube to challenge the paradigm you just mentioned. You just summarized it as sanctuaries are good, zoos are bad. But I wonder, it's possible I'm the first vegan even in print, because the written history of veganism is not that long. And that's certainly an obscure and edgy enough issue. It's possible no other vegan ever took the stand I did, which basically is anti-sanctuary. And the thing with zoos, I've repeatedly drawn attention to this concept of obsolescence. Most recently in the video about economics, where I say, look, we're not going to make vivisection obsolete. I'd love it if we could, but that's not the situation we're in now. I don't think we're going to make zoos obsolete. In that sense. The circus we can get rid of. This is the difference between the zoo and the circus. And Blackfish was out. It's possible I already mentioned to you, but it's nothing anecdote. One of my professors in Canada, he was at the elite level of whale activism. So specifically West Coast killer whales. He'd made documentary films and stuff. He had connections in government and whatever. So he was a long time involved in that. And I made some comment to him. I said, well, now that this movie Blackfish has come out, won't there be pressure on you to kind of never talk to and never cooperate with the people at SeaWorld again? And I'm sorry if I'm getting the name wrong. I think the park there is SeaWorld. If it's not SeaWorld, it's a competitor that's very similar to SeaWorld. But, there's a park like that on the West Coast there. And he turned to me with no pause, without missing a beat, and he said, that park, that amusement park that exploits whales or whatever, he said, that is the only infrastructure the government has to deal with sick or injured whales. And it was created by this private sector company, so they could put on these acrobatic shows or whatever, these exploitative shows. He says, that's all we've got. If there's ever a problem, if there's ever an outbreak, and he has all these statistics. The West Coast pod is down to its last 7 reproducing females. They're on the edge of extinction, blah, blah, blah. Just in that area. He said our only capacity to do something good to help, ensure the future of this species actually depends on that park. So that was a shock to me. I wasn't expecting him to say anything like that. I was expecting him to make some kind of catty remark that, he'd like to see SeaWorld burn. But no, on the contrary, he said that's all we've got. So that was interesting. And, I'm sure in terms of the conservation role that some zoos do play, and in theory all zoos can play, there will be parallels to that with other species. And I've told, yeah, you got excited about it because I had that video. We have these unique species of monkey here in Yunnan, right on the edge of extinction, because they only eat moss, right? The bulk of their diet is moss. Remember that?
I think it's lichen.
Lichen. Thank you. See, don't get them mixed up. You can't feed them moss. It's got lichen. These lichen-eating monkeys evolved for eating lichen. And it's grim as hell seeing them in zoos. Those monkeys, it is. I wish I could say nothing is grimmer. The grimmest here are the elephants. Seeing the elephants here in China, that's really more moving than Dante's Inferno or Dante's Purgatory. I mean, it's really hell to see the elephants in chains here, and it makes you that makes you want to resort to violence. Seeing the elephants like that here. So I'm starting to tear. I'm starting to tear up thinking about it. I'm starting to cry thinking about it. The situation with the elephants.
It's not all bad for those monkeys. They got hot dogs on a stick. That they can go after.
Yeah, but I mean that's anyway. Look, but as terrible as the situation is with zoos, and I've seen zoos here that are terrible. I mentioned in a recent video. I don't know if you caught it yet. The tigers. Literally with pieces of meat dangling from fishing lines. Did you catch that yet?
There's gonna be a line and a clip of that in my next video.
Okay, great.
It's a place where you can go and catch fish for a tiger with a hot dog on a stick.
That's right. They were strips of raw meat. They weren't cooked meat, so they were raw meat. But yeah, go on.
I like the hot. I'm gonna stick with the hot dog line. I like that one.
It's a more evocative image, but yeah.
It's what's surreal about watching that video in particular, seeing a tiger with a hot dog on a stick, because I've actually had the experience of talking to people who have paid, I don't know how much you charge for this piece of meat on a stick, but I've talked.
I didn't ask. They would have sold me one.
I've had the experience talking to people who just got to see the most endangered, the rarest canine on earth, the Mexican gray wolf.
Okay.
And they paid. I don't even know if they paid $5 for it. We gave, there was in California, we gave this group this campsite this really great deal to see these really endangered animals. And I remember having conversations with people oh, this wasn't for free. Not only does your money go to seeing these really rare animals,
yeah,
but it actually goes to an organization that is not for profit. That is actually involved in conversations. I could literally say, you see those cages back there? Those wolves will go to the wild. They will literally live in the wild. They will literally have pups in the wild. You are literally seeing a part of a program that is actually bringing a species, and it wasn't worth it. Hot dog on a stick, worth it every time.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I love about it in terms of the wildlife management paradigm. Basically, I want animals to live in their own domain. You know what I mean? I basically want all animals to be treated like sharks. You know what I mean? It's okay. I mean, it's okay to watch them in a documentary. It's okay to stand on the edge of the shore and look in. But I mean, I wish we had more of an attitude like this in Western culture. But it's obviously it's not at all. The puppy-centered attitude instead is people want to interact with the animals. They want to play with the animals. They want to see if they can get a reaction out of them. And yeah, I have seen people here in China with bears in cages, and the cage isn't that much bigger than the bear. You get a great huge bear poking at the bears with sticks and forcing through food to try to get a reaction out of the bear. Little pieces of meat or hot dogs or whatever they had, trying to interact with the bear in these ways. But hey, I don't know. I mean, when my father was a child, we literally had bear wrestling in Canada, and bears in cages for humans getting in and wrestling the bears and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's not. You know what happened to Gary Yourofsky? A lot of people who are involved in the animal rights side of things, they get more and more misanthropic until they just end up hating the human race because they see this side of human nature for too long, right? But look, I hope it's something positive you can carry with you. I don't know how it'll ever come back into your life, but you had this period of your life when zoos and habitat conservation and this kind of work with animals was really your main thing. Maybe it'll be in your old age, maybe it'll be at some other point. But I hope that can come back into your life in a meaningful way.
The big way actually that it's been positive is like, because right now, basically what I do is I'm a sub in the school systems, and that involves going to elementary schools and middle schools. And one of the things that you can talk, like the kids like hearing those stories.
Yeah.
Like their favorite story is the one I have about the polar bear, and it's not even a first-hand story, but I remember the zoo that I worked at was kind of famous in the area because a long time ago they had this polar bear, and that was like a big thing back then to go and see like this white bear that was out in the hot sun in the summer, like roasting, on the concrete. Everyone loved the polar bear. Everyone loved him. Everyone had great stories. In fact, I remember walking around the zoo, and I remember I'll never forget this one group of guests. And I'll remember exactly what they said perfect. They said, they were by the llamas, they were by, a few, conservation exhibits, animals that were part of species survival programs. They were just standing there, well, this is retarded. Where are all the lions and the bears? I didn't come to see this. What is this? This is like a mouse? What's going on? I remember the Boston accent. I remember everything. They did not get it. There's a hot dog on a stick with China that those families would be, lining up to buy.
That's where habitat conservation begins, is when it's no longer existing for human entertainment or human exploitation. When the wilderness exists just to be the wilderness, and that's the hardest thing for human beings to do. Ultimately, human beings create the wilderness because they create a barrier and they don't allow other human beings to cut down the trees on the other side of that barrier or go and hunt the animals that that barrier. That's in the 21st century. All wilderness is human created because at a minimum we have to employ people to stop the other humans from destroying it. That's the fragile millennium we're going into now. And there was a time when I was fucked up with that. There was a time when emotionally it was oh my God, is this the world my children are going to be born into? A world where there is really no wilderness and so on. But I got over it.
I didn't actually say what the story about the polar bear was, did I?
Sure, do it.
The story about the polar bear is a brief thing that my manager used to talk about. He basically when they would do medicals for the animal, when they would do the physicals every year, they couldn't dart the polar bear.
Oh,
and it has something to do with their skin being so thick or something like that you literally can't dart them in their hide. They had to train them to get up on the fence. And a polar bear is a huge animal, probably the biggest bear species. And
I believe it is, yeah.
I've seen grizzly bears that were 10 feet tall and stuff like that. And he'd have to get up on the fence. So they'd have to jab stick him under the armpit because that's the only place that it was soft enough. That is the favorite story of elementary school kids. I'm not sure why, but that always gets the best reaction. But I have been able to tell some interesting stories that not many science teachers or really any other teacher. I remember one time I was just an aide in the class, and I told her I was a zookeeper, and she was like, "Oh, we have to schedule 15 minutes for the kids to ask you questions about animals."
Yeah.
And which ended up being more 30 or 40 minutes because everyone and anyone had to ask their best and some of the dumber questions about animals. Yeah. I have a lot of good stuff. I have a lot of good memories now talking to kids about animals and stuff like that, and hearing what they think and things like that. So that's been the most positive thing that's recently come out of it, I would have to say. More so than talking about it on YouTube in a way.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm happy for you. I just made a video talking about the extent to which the different missions I was on ended in failure, and I feel like I've got nothing positive, to bring forward in my life. I guess I can still speak Thai and Laotian. I guess coming up pretty soon, I'm going back to Thailand, so I'm gonna have to learn that language again. Brush up or remind myself how to speak that language a little bit for a while I'm in Thailand. But that is something positive you get to carry with you for the rest of your life. So I'm happy to hear that. I'm happy. I'm glad you're not in the situation where you feel like you're a failed zookeeper. And every day you wake up and resent that you're not getting the smell of that zoo poo, shoveling manure, because that's the story you're not telling the children about. That's the other reality, right? Is baling the hay. And the last zoo I went to in Kunming, you could see they did have large groups of all the monkey species living together. They had many different species of monkey, so the monkeys weren't isolated in that sense. They were in whole troops, but they were absolutely constantly mating and constantly getting pregnant and producing more monkeys. And I assume those monkeys would be sold on to other zoos, because obviously they can't have a constantly expanding monkey population, or sold on to be used for other purposes, right? Whether that's scientific experimentation or meat or what have you. My translator, she absolutely says to me, in China, there are some really broad laws that various kinds of animals can just never be killed for meat, including deer. She really insisted to me that in China it's illegal. It's out to kill deer under any circumstance or beat. I'm like, come on, you must be joking. But whether or not those laws exist, I don't know. Because every day, the exhibits were getting pregnant, to put it that way, and every month the population would be increasing if they weren't doing something to export the new births or to eliminate them, to liquidate them. So yeah, those would be their choices.
Now, because I wonder, because I remember there's like an idiom about animals in captivity, if given the opportunity, they'll mate the way they should. It's basically a way to explain, mating with brothers and sisters in captivity, and there's kind of I didn't think about it sad as a time, but the zoo, AZA zoos manage really well. And I don't know the extent to how they do this, how much space they have for a certain species of animal. There are times when you can't breed certain animals because there's literally no space for any more.
Right.
Like, you don't have any zoos to send them to that have the proper, but that requires a lot of, kind of really sad things, whether it's not literally implanting an animal with outside hormones so that they don't, don't actually get pregnant when they mate, or just strictly separating animals. That live right next to each other and that have, those instincts intact.
I know for lions, they have mechanical forms of birth control where they put, they insert a device into the female or lion and so on. I know that some of that has been, so there is in effect birth control rather than castration or other more invasive, the equivalent of the birth control pill, but it is actually, a mechanism that's releasing necessary chemicals, what have you. Obviously, this is not something I've looked into at great length. I assume that's also because of the extraordinary cost of keeping lions. But yeah, I'd say too, in another sense in which I think modern humans, who are in many ways separated from the life of the instincts, separated from the life of the wild, I think that's also, just like the monkeys in the cage that I was just describing in the zoo in China. For those monkeys in the cage, sexuality is the only instinct they've got left. It's the only instinct they can still exercise, right, inside that cage. There's nothing else they can do. So I'm guessing all their time and energy basically goes into sex, because it's the only part of their nature they can still exercise. And I don't know. For me, living in this modern society in this cage of my own making, there's some truth to that too. We've gotten rid of the experience of most of the other instincts, including fear. A lot of people want to live very safe lives and never feel afraid and so on. And I guess more of our mental energy goes into the last remaining instinct we got.
Cage within a cage.
Yeah.
À-bas-le-ciel.